Nice block, Speedy. No storm can withstand my rain, rain, go array.
Way to go, Lanterman! Severe thunderstorm crisis averted!
Thanks, Marcia Starfighter. Just keeping the galaxy safe.
Staggering starbursts! My emergency alert system indicates that Sunnytown, California is having a storm of their own. We need to make sure the Ramos family is prepared.
Put on your galoshes, Speedy. Things are about to get stormy. To Saturn, then the...
Lanterman, wait! Earth is a Class 5 planet. You'll need to blend in.
Roger that, Marcia. Activate disguise ray.
Genius! Assume identity of Emergency Coordinator Larry!
To Saturn, then the stars!
Superheroes, I'm a lucky duck!
We interrupt this program to bring you an announcement from the National Weather Service. A severe storm warning is in place for all of Sunnytown, California due to the approaching hurricane. Be prepared for heavy rains, flooding, hail, and damaging winds. Authorities have advised residents to shelter in place. Stay tuned for updates.
That sounds serious.
Hello?
Hey, Isabel, it's Vinny.
Oh, hola, Vinny.
No need to panic, just letting you know that we got an emergency alert for your area. You need to shelter in place. Looks like the storm is getting worse.
Thanks, Vinny. We just heard the warning on the radio.
Great. Let's make sure Sophia's chair and PEX board are fully charged in case you lose power.
No worries, Vinny. Sophia always keeps her batteries charged. Right, Sophia?
I forgot.
I've got the generator. Phew, it's getting bad out there. Now we'll have backup for Sophia's chair and PEX board if we lose power.
See? I am a lucky duck.
You've got to stop saying that.
Vinny? Vinny! We lost cell service too. No se preocupen, don't worry. We've got flashlights and plenty of food. Xochitl, go get some candles from the kitchen.
Greetings, good citizens. I was told you lost contact with your service coordinator and was asked to stop by to make sure you're all okay.
We lost our power.
I see that. Do you have all the food and water you need?
I think we're covered at the moment. But what if the storm gets worse? Should we leave?
When the weather is this bad, it's safer for you to stay put and listen for updates. If there's a need to evacuate, the proper authorities will notify you. Emergency Coordinator Turtle? Always make sure you have a battery-operated radio to stay tuned for updates.
Hey, Mom, I've got the candles.
Yeah.
Ah, now you have power and knowledge. Crisis averted. Our work here is done.
Who was that guy?
Another successful mission. Thanks to you, the Ramos family knows that during a severe storm, it's important to shelter in place unless you are officially told to evacuate. Have extra batteries, flashlights, and a backup generator on hand in case of a power outage. Have enough food and water on hand to last for a few days. And
Stay tuned to weather updates and emergency notifications during a storm. You might need a battery-operated radio for that. Remember, good citizens, prepare today for a safe tomorrow. And if you need any support, contact your regional center. To Saturn, then the stars!